Hey listeners, here I am back with the concluding part of the story, the tape measure murder. You are not overlooking the possibility that the husband was deliberately got out of the way by someone who wanted to murder Mrs. Spenlow? You are thinking of young Ted Gerard, aren't you, sir? I've been working on him. What we are up against, there is lack of motive. He doesn't stand to gain anything. He is an undesirable character though. Quite a pretty little spot of embezzlement to his credit. I'm not saying he isn't a wrong one. Still, he did go to his boss and own up to that embezzlement, and his employers weren't wise to it. An Oxford grouper, said Melchett. Yes, sir. Became a convert and went off to do the straight thing and own up to having pinched money. I'm not saying, mind you, that it mayn't have been astuteness. He may have thought he was suspected and decided to gamble on honest repentance. You have a skeptical mind, Slack, said Colonel Melchett. By the way, have you talked to Miss Marple at all? What's she got to do with it, sir? Oh, nothing. But she hears things, you know. Why don't you go and have a chat with her? She's a very sharp old lady. Slack changed the subject. One thing I have been meaning to ask you, sir. The domestic service job where the deceased started her career, Sir Robert Abercrombie's place, that's where the jewel robbery was. Emeralds worth the packet. Never got them. I've been looking it up. Must have happened when the Spenlow woman was there. Though she would have been quite a girl at that time. Don't think she was mixed up in that, do you, sir? Spenlow, you know, was one of those little twopenny, halfpenny jewelers, just the chap for a fence. Melchett shook his head. Don't think there is anything in that. She didn't even know Spenlow at the time. I remember the case. Opinion in police circles was that a son of the house was mixed up in it. Jim Abercrombie, awful young waster, had a pile of debts, and just after the robbery, they were all paid off. Some rich woman, so they said. But I don't know. Old Abercrombie's hedged a bit about the case. Tried to call the police off. It was just an idea, sir, said Slack. Now really, that's very kind of Colonel Melchett. I didn't know. He remembered me. He remembers you all right. Told me that what you didn't know of what goes on in St. Mary Meads isn't worth knowing. Too kind of him. But really I don't know anything at all. About this murder, I mean. You know what the talk about it is? Oh, of course. But it wouldn't do. Would it? To repeat just idle talk? Slack said with an attempt at geniality. This isn't an official conversation, you know. It's in confidence, so to speak. You mean you really want to know what people are saying? Whether there is any truth in it or not. That's the idea. Well, of course, there's been a great deal of talk and speculation. And there are really two distinct camps, if you understand me. To begin with, there are people who think that the husband did it. A husband or a wife is, in a way, the natural person to suspect, don't you think so? Maybe, said the inspector cautiously. Such close quarters, you know. Then, so often, the money angle. I hear that it was Mrs. Spenlow who had the money, and therefore Mr. Spenlow does benefit by her death. In this wicked world, I am afraid the most uncharitable assumptions are often justified. He comes into a tidy sum all right. Just so. It would seem quite plausible, wouldn't it, for him to strangle her leave the house by the back, come across the fields to my house, ask for me and pretend he had a telephone call from me, then go back and find his wife murdered in his absence, hoping, of course, that the crime would be put down to some tramp or burglar. The inspector nodded. What with the money angle? And if they had been on bad terms lately? But Miss Marple interrupted him. Oh, but they hadn't. You know that for a fact. Everyone would have known if they had quarrelled. The maid, Gladys Brent, she would have soon spread it round the village. The inspector said feebly, she mightn't have known, and received a pitying smile in reply. Miss Marple went on. And then there's the other school of thought, Ted Gerard. A good-looking young man, I'm afraid you know that good looks are inclined to influence one more than they should. Our last curate but one, quite a magical effect. All the girls came to church, evening service as well as morning, and many older women became unusually active in parish work, and the slippers and scarves that were made for him. Quite embarrassing for the poor young man. But let me see, where was I? Oh yes, this young man, Ted Gerard, of course. There has been talk about him. He has come down to see her so often. Though Mrs. Spenlow told me herself that he was a member of what I think they call the Oxford Group, a religious movement. They are quite sincere and very earnest, I believe, and Mrs. Spenlow was impressed by it all. Miss Marple took a breath and went on. And I'm sure there was no reason to believe that there was anything more in it than that. But you know what people are. Quite a lot of people are convinced that Mrs. Spenlow was infatuated with the young man and that he would lend him quite a lot of money. And perfectly true that he was actually seen at the station that day. In the train, the 2:27 down train. But of course, it would be quite easy, wouldn't it, to slip out of the other side of the train and go through the cutting and over the fence and round by the hedge and never come out of the station entrance at all, so that he need not have been seen going to the cottage. And of course, people do think that what Mrs. Spenlow was wearing was rather peculiar. Peculiar? A kimono, not a dress. Miss Marple blushed. That sort of a thing, you know, is perhaps rather suggestive to some people. You think it was suggestive? Oh no, I don't think so. I think it was perfectly natural. You think it was natural? Under the circumstances, yes. Miss Marple's glance was cool and reflective. Inspector Slack said it might give us another motive for the husband. Jealousy. Oh no, Mr. Spenlow would never be jealous. He is not the sort of man who notices things. If his wife had gone away and left a note on the pincushion, it would be the first he would know of anything of that kind. Inspector Slack was puzzled by the intent way she was looking at him. He had an idea that all her conversation was intended to hint at something he didn't understand. She said now with some emphasis, "Didn't you find any clues, Inspector, on the spot?" People don't leave fingerprints in cigarette ash nowadays, Miss Marple. But this, I think she suggested, was an old-fashioned crime. Slack said sharply, "Now what do you mean by that?" Miss Marple remarked slowly, "I think you know that Constable Pock could help you. He was the first person on the scene of crime, as they say." Mr. Spenlow was sitting in a deck chair. He looked bewildered. He said in his thin, precise voice, "I may, of course, be imagining what occurred. My hearing is not as good as it was. But I distinctly think I heard a small boy call after me. Yeah, who's a crippen? It conveyed the impression to me that he was of the opinion that I had killed my dear wife. Miss Marple, gently snipping off a dead rose head, said, "That was the impression he meant to convey, no doubt." But what could possibly have put such an idea into a child's head? Miss Marple coughed, listening no doubt to the opinion of his elders. You really mean that other people think that too? Quite half of the people in St. Mary Mead. But, my dear lady, what can possibly have given rise to such an idea? I was sincerely attached to my wife. She did not, alas, take to living in the country as much as I had hoped she would do. But perfect agreement on every subject is an impossible idea. I assure you I feel her loss very keenly. Probably, but if you will excuse my saying so, you don't sound as though you do. Mr. Spenlow drew his meagre frame up to its full height. My dear lady, many years ago, I read of a certain Chinese philosopher who, when his dearly loved wife was taken from him, continued calmly to beat a gong in the street, a customary Chinese pastime. I presume, exactly as usual, the people of the city were much impressed by his fortitude. But, said Miss Marple, the people of St. Mary Mead react rather differently. Chinese philosophy does not appeal to them. But you understand? Miss Marple nodded. My Uncle Henry, she explained, was a man of unusual self-control. His motto was, never display emotions. He too was very fond of flowers. I was thinking, said Mr. Spenlow with something like eagerness, that I might perhaps have a pergola on the west side of the cottage, pink roses and perhaps wisteria. And there is a white starry flower whose name for the moment escapes me. In the tone in which she spoke to her grandnephew, aged 3, Miss Marple said, I have a very nice catalogue here with pictures. Perhaps you would like to look through it. I have to go up to the village. Leaving Mr. Spenlow sitting happily in the garden with his catalogue, Miss Marple went up to her room, hastily rolled up a dress in a piece of brown paper, and leaving the house, walked briskly up to the post office. Miss Polite, the dressmaker, lived in the room over the post office. But Miss Marple did not at once go through the door and up the stairs. It was just 2:30, and a minute late, the much Benham bus drew up outside the post office door. It was one of the events of the day in St. Mary Mead. The postmistress hurried out with parcels connected with the shop side of her business, for the post office also dealt in sweets, cheap books, and children's toys. For some minutes, Miss Marple was alone in the post office. Not till the postmistress returned to her post did Miss Marple go upstairs and explain to Miss Polite that she wanted her old grey crepe altered and made more fashionable if that was possible. Miss Polite promised to see what she could do. The chief constable was rather astonished when Miss Marple's name was brought to him. She came in with many apologies. So sorry, so very sorry to disturb you. You're so busy, I know. But then you have always been so very kind, Colonel Milchlet, and I felt I would rather come to you instead of Inspector Slack. For one thing, you know, I should hate Constable Pock to get into any trouble. Strictly speaking, I suppose he shouldn't have touched anything at all. Colonel Milchett was slightly bewildered. He said, Pock? That's the St. Mary Mead constable, isn't it? What has he been doing? He picked up a pin, you know. It was in his tunic. And it occurred to me at the time that it was quite probable he had actually picked it up in Mrs. Spenlow's house. Quite, but after all, what's a pin? Matter of fact, he did pick the pin up just by Mrs. Spenlow's body. Came and told Slag about it yesterday. You put him up to that, I gather? Ought to have touched nothing, of course. But as I said, what's a pin? It was only a common pin, sort of thing any woman might use. Oh no, Colonel Milchet, that's where you are wrong. To a man's eye, perhaps, it looked like an ordinary pin, but it wasn't. It was a special pin, a very thin pin, the kind you buy by the box, the kind used mostly by dressmakers. Milchet stared at her, a faint light of comprehension breaking in on him. Miss Marple nodded her head several times eagerly. Yes, of course. It seemed to me so obvious. She was in her kimono because she was going to try on her new dress. And she went into the front room and Miss Polite just said something about measurements and put the tape measure round her neck. And then all she would have to do was to cross it and pull. Quite easy, so I've heard. And then, of course, she would go outside, pull the door to, and stand there knocking as though she had just arrived. But the pin shows she had already been in the house. And it was Miss Polite who telephoned to Spenlow? Yes, from the post office at 2:30, just when the bus comes and the post office would be empty. Colonel Milchet said, But my dear Miss Marple, why? In heaven's name, why? You can't have a murder without a motive. Well, I think, Colonel Milchet, from all I've heard, that the crime dates from a long time back. It reminds me, of my two cousins, Anthony and Gordon. Whatever Anthony did always went right for him, and with poor Gordon, it was just the other way about. Racehorses went lame, stocks went down, and property depreciated. As I say it, the two women were in it together. In what? The robbery. Long ago. Very valuable emeralds, so I've heard. The lady's maid and the tweenie, because one thing hasn't been explained. How, when the tweenie married the gardener, did they have enough money to set up a flower shop? The answer is, it was her share of the swag. I think is the right expression. Everything she did turned out well. Money made money, but the other one, the lady's maid, must have been unlucky. She came down to being just a village dressmaker. Then they met again, quite all right at first, expect, until Mr. Ted Gerard came on the scene. Mrs. Spenlow, you see, was already suffering from conscience and was inclined to be emotionally religious. This young man, no doubt, urged her to face up and to come clean, and I dare say she was strung up to do it. But Miss Polite didn't say it that way. All she saw was that she might go to prison for a robbery she had committed years ago. So she made up her mind to put a stop to it all. I'm afraid that she was always rather a wicked woman. I don't believe she would have turned her hair if that nice, stupid Mr. Spenlow had been hanged. Colonel Milchet said slowly, We can verify your theory up to a point. The identity of the Polite woman with the lady's maid at the Abercrombies, but Miss Marple reassured him. It will be all quite easy. She is the kind of woman who will break down at once when she is taxed with the truth. And then you see, I've got her tape measure. I abstracted it yesterday when I was trying on. When she misses it and thinks the police have got it, Well, she's quite an ignorant woman and she'll think it will prove the case against her in some way. She smiled at him encouragingly. You'll have no trouble, I can assure you. It was the tone in which his favorite aunt had once assured him that he could not fail to pass his entrance examination into Sandhurst. And he had passed. Thank you.